This is the story of a woman judged by the world solely because of her appearance. But when her most dangerous enemy appears, she is the only one standing firm. If you think true love cares about looks, watch until the end. You'll change your mind. Like now, and comment the name of the city you're watching in, so I know how far my story has progressed. Now, let's begin. The baby wouldn't stop crying. Marlo Bennett had tried everything she knew, which wasn't much, if she was being honest. She'd tried rocking Rose against her chest. She'd tried humming the half-remembered scraps of a song her mother used to sing before the drinking got bad. She tried holding the baby up to the train window so the blur of passing Nebraska grassland might distract her, though what a 4-month-old was supposed to make of all that brown and gray stretched endlessly beneath a February sky was anyone's guess. Nothing worked. Rose cried, and Marlo sat with her back pressed against the wooden bench and her jaw set hard, and she did not cry herself because she had decided somewhere around the Iowa border that she was done with that particular indulgence. There would be time for crying later, maybe. Or maybe not. Either way, she couldn't afford it right now. The man across the aisle kept glancing over. He was maybe 50, heavy-set himself, with a wool coat that had seen better decades and a newspaper folded on his knee that he hadn't actually read in some time. Every time Rose wailed, his eyes would cut sideways toward Marlo with that particular expression she had learned to recognize before she was old enough to name it. Not cruelty, exactly. Something quieter than that. The mild, reflexive surprise of a person cataloging everything wrong with what they were looking at. She was too fat to be traveling alone. Too young to have a baby. Too something, always, for whatever room she happened to be in. Marlo pulled Rose tighter and looked out the window. The letter from Silas Mercer was folded in the inside pocket of her coat, pressed against her ribs where she could feel it with every breath. She'd read it enough times that she could recite it by memory, though she still wasn't sure what to make of the man who'd written it. His advertisement in the Chicago paper had been plain to the point of almost rude. Cattle rancher, 34 years, seeks capable woman for companionship and partnership. Nebraska frontier. Must be willing to work. No pretense required. She'd read dozens of those advertisements over the years, mostly out of bored curiosity, and most of them wanted to know about a woman's figure, or her hair, or her cooking before they got around to whether she had a brain in her head. Silas Mercer had not mentioned any of that. She'd almost not written back. She'd stared at the paper for 2 days before she picked up a pen, and even then she'd been honest in a way that felt like standing at the edge of something with no way to know how deep the water was. She'd told him she was 24. She told him she was big. Her word, blunt and deliberate, because she'd learned the hard way that surprises of that particular variety tended to go badly. She told him she was not what most men were looking for. She told him she was in a difficult situation that she couldn't fully explain in a letter, and that she was traveling with an infant who was not biologically her own, and that if any of that was a problem, she understood completely. She'd waited 3 weeks for his reply, certain there wouldn't be one. His letter had been 6 sentences. Miss Bennett, none of what you've described presents a problem. I have a working ranch and a spare room and more livestock than I can reasonably manage alone. I'm not looking for a particular kind of woman. I'm looking for an honest one. Come when you're ready. She had been on a train 48 hours later. Chotien. The depot at Caldwell Creek was smaller than she'd expected, which was saying something, because she hadn't expected much. It was a single low building with a stove that wasn't pulling right, and a station master who looked up at her from behind a window grill, took in the bundle in her arms and the size of her and the state of her coat, and said nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if he'd said something. Marlo stepped out onto the platform and let the cold hit her. It was a particular kind of cold she hadn't encountered before. Chicago winters were brutal and damp, city cold that pressed in from all sides and smelled of coal smoke and garbage. This was something different. This was flat and clean and enormous. The kind of cold that came from open space with nothing to stop it, nothing to break it, just miles and miles of frozen ground running out to a horizon that seemed farther away than it had any right to be. The sky was the color of old pewter. The wind came in from the northwest with a sound like something breathing. Rose had finally fallen asleep somewhere in the last hour of the journey, worn out from her own crying, and now she made small fussing movements against Marlo's chest without waking. Marlo stood on the platform with her single bag at her feet and looked at the town. 2 streets wide, maybe 3 blocks long, a general store, and a livery and a church and a scattering of frame houses set back from the road, and thought, this is it. This is what you traded everything for. She didn't know whether that was good or bad yet. Miss Bennet, the voice came from her left. She turned. He was taller than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure why she'd formed any particular expectation from 6 sentences on a piece of paper. Lean in the way of men who work outside in all weather, with a face that the cold and the sun had worked on equally. Not old, but used, the way good tools get used. Brown hair going a little rough under a hat that had seen too many winters. Eyes that were some indeterminate color between gray and green and that were, she noticed almost immediately, looking directly at her face rather than doing the slow inventory that most men's eyes did when they first encountered her. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He crossed the platform in a few strides and stopped a few feet away, the appropriate distance, and looked at her with the kind of attention that wasn't rude, but wasn't careless either. Then he looked down at Rose, still bundled against Marlowe's chest. "She sleeping?" he said. "Finally," Marlowe said. "She cried most of the way from Omaha." "Long way to cry." "Yes." He picked up her bag without being asked. "Wagon's out front. It's about 40 minutes to the ranch. You want to eat first? There's a place on the main street that does a decent breakfast." Marlowe hadn't eaten since the day before. She hadn't wanted to spend the money. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her. It wasn't an accusatory look, just a considering one. "It's on me," he said, and walked toward the depot door. She followed him. The place on the main street was called Hetty's, and it was warm inside, which was the best thing about it. A woman with iron gray hair and a red apron looked up when they came in, and her gaze moved over Marlowe with the speed and thoroughness of long practice. And then she said, "Sit where you like, Silas," with the tone of someone whose opinion she'd decided to keep to herself, for now. Marlowe took the chair that put her back to the wall. Old habit. She ordered eggs and coffee. Silas ordered the same. Rose woke up when Marlowe set her carefully on the table between them, swaddled in the blanket Marlowe had bought second-hand in Chicago, and looked around the room with the wide, unfocused attention of an infant who has just decided the world is large and strange. "She's healthy," Silas said. He wasn't reaching for the baby, wasn't performing any particular warmth about her, just asking. "As far as I can tell, she eats well. She's gaining weight." He nodded. "Whose is she?" It wasn't a question quite, more like a statement with a question mark somewhere inside it. Marlowe had thought about how she would answer this, had rehearsed several versions on the train. "Her mother was my neighbor," she said, "in Chicago. Her name was Clara. She was in a bad situation. The man she was with." She paused. "Clara died in November. Fever that got into her lungs. There wasn't anyone else. And the father..." Marlowe's hand had been resting on the table. She felt it tighten. "He's not someone who should be near a child." Silas looked at her for a moment. His coffee had arrived and he wrapped both hands around the cup but didn't drink yet. "All right," he said. "All right? You don't have to say more than that right now." She studied him. She'd learned a long time ago that men who told you that you didn't have to explain yourself were often the ones who would demand explanation later, at a moment when you had less leverage. She'd been on the receiving end of that particular strategy more than once, but Silas Mercer was already looking out the window at the empty street, with the expression of a man who'd said his piece and meant it, and didn't need anything further from the conversation, and something about that, the absence of the angle, the lack of any visible maneuvering, made her shoulders come down a half-inch from where they'd been holding. She picked up her coffee and drank. The ranch was 40 minutes from town, the way he'd said, along a track that cut through low hills and frozen creek beds and past stands of cottonwood that stood bare and gray against the sky. The wagon was cold, but he'd put a blanket across the seat, and there was another in the back for luggage, and he drove without much conversation, which she appreciated. She had enough to take in. The land was unlike anything she'd grown up with. Chicago was density and noise and the constant pressure of other people's presence. This was its exact opposite. Out here, you could see trouble coming from a long way off, which was either reassuring or frightening depending on what kind of trouble it was and what you planned to do about it. The house came into view around a curve in the track, a 2-story frame house that was plain but solid, recently repaired by the look of the roof, with a barn and two smaller outbuildings behind it, and a fence that ran out in both directions and disappeared into the winter-brown grass. Smoke was coming from the chimney. Someone had left a lantern burning in the front window. "You've got help?" Marlowe asked. "Hired man named Deke. Lives in the bunkhouse. He stocked the stove this morning." Silas pulled the horses up in front of the house and set the brake. "He's not much for company, but he works hard and he's honest." She climbed down without waiting for help. Partly pride, partly the simple logistical difficulty of someone handing down a baby while also climbing down from a wagon, and stood in the yard looking up at the house. It was not beautiful. The paint on the porch posts was peeling. One of the porch boards had been replaced recently and didn't quite match the rest. The yard was utilitarian rather than welcoming. No attempt at a garden or a decorative border, just hard-packed earth and the practical infrastructure of a working ranch. It was the house of a man who'd been living alone long enough that he'd stopped seeing what was missing. But the chimney was going and there was light in the window. And Marlowe had spent the last 6 weeks sleeping in a rooming house where the walls were so thin she could hear the couple in the next room fight every night. And before that, she had been in a place she preferred not to think about. "It's good," she said. Silas looked at her. There was something in his expression that she couldn't fully read. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. Like he'd braced for a different answer and wasn't sure what to do with this one. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you where things are." Tom. The room he gave her was small but clean, with a window that looked east toward where the sun would come up, and a bed with a proper frame and a quilt folded at the foot that looked like someone's grandmother had made it with serious intention. There was a chest of drawers and a washstand and a hook on the back of the door. He'd put a small wooden box in the corner lined with another blanket. For Rose, she understood. The thoughtfulness of it, the fact that he'd thought of it at all, made something in her chest do something uncomfortable that she decided to ignore for now. "It's not fancy," he said from the doorway. "It's fine," she said. "It's more than fine." He showed her the kitchen, which was well equipped in a rough-edged way, a good stove and adequate pots, and a pantry that was stocked with the basics, if not the luxuries. He showed her where the water pump was and explained that in winter it needed to be primed in the morning. He showed her the barn, because she'd asked, and walked her through the animals, 12 cattle, 2 horses, a half-dozen chickens, with the brisk efficiency of a man who'd been explaining the same things to himself for years and wasn't accustomed to an audience. Deke turned out to be a man somewhere north of 50, with a face like a dried creek bed and a handshake that suggested he'd spent the last 3 decades apologizing to fence posts. He nodded at Marlowe, looked at Rose with the expression of a man who had not signed up for infants, but was too well-mannered to say so, and went back to whatever he was doing with the harness he'd been mending. "He'll warm up," Silas said when they were back in the yard. "I'm not worried about him," Marlowe said. And she wasn't. Deke was an inconvenience at worst, a neutral fact of the landscape like the cold or the flat horizon. The things she was worried about were not standing in the yard of a Nebraska cattle ranch. They were back in Chicago, and they had a name, and the name was Gideon Hale, and she had been carrying the weight of that name in the back of her throat for 6 weeks, like something she couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. She hadn't told Silas the full truth yet. She would have to. She understood that. A man who'd agreed to take in a woman and a baby based on a 6-sentence letter deserved the truth of what he was taking in, and she intended to give it to him. Just not today. Today she needed to get through the day. She needed to feed Rose and figure out where things were and get through tonight without falling apart, and then tomorrow she could think about what to tell him and how. That was the plan. Dinner was quiet the way that meals between strangers tend to be when both parties are making a genuine effort not to make the other uncomfortable. He'd put a pot of beef stew on that morning before going to town. She found that out when she lifted the lid, and the smell of it hit her, and she had to stand very still for a moment and breathe. And she made biscuits while Rose slept in the wooden box by the stove. Her biscuits were good. She knew they were good. Her aunt had taught her, and her aunt had been the sort of woman who believed that if a thing was worth doing at all, it was worth doing until you couldn't do it better. Silas ate 2 of them and didn't say anything except good biscuits, which she was beginning to understand was high praise by his standards. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked up from his bowl. "Your advertisement. You didn't say, most of the advertisements I've seen, The men describe what they're looking for, specifically, and you didn't. He considered this, not like the question had caught him off guard, more like he was giving it the weight it deserved. I've known men who put out those advertisements, he said, and most of them knew what they wanted the way you know what you want when you're ordering a horse, by the markings. He picked up his coffee. I'm not looking for a particular set of markings. Then what are you looking for? Someone who shows up, he said, and does the work, and is straight with me. It was such a simple answer that she almost laughed, not from amusement, but from the particular relief of hearing a thing that didn't have anything hidden in it. I'll be straight with you, she said, when I know how. He looked at her steadily. That's enough for now. But she lay awake that night in the small, east-facing room with Rose asleep beside her in the wooden box, listening to the wind move across the plains outside. It sounded different than city wind. In the city, wind was something that happened to buildings, that found the gaps between them and made itself known. Out here, it was the other way around. The wind was the fact, and the buildings were the intrusion. Small wooden protests against something that had been here a great deal longer and intended to go on long after. She thought about Clara. Clara, who had been 22 years old and pretty in the desperate way of women who know their looks are their only leverage and spend them accordingly. Clara, who had fallen in with Gideon Hale the way people fall into rivers, by being near the bank when the ground gave way. Clara, who had showed up at Marlowe's door at 2 a.m. 6 weeks before she died, with a split lip and a baby in her arms, and that particular look in her eyes of a woman who has run out of options she can see. Marlowe had not been in a position to take anyone in. She'd been in 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of a building on Halsted Street, working at a laundry 6 days a week, and saving money in a coffee tin under the floorboard because banks were for people who had enough to put in them. She had her own problems, and her own history, and her own reasons for keeping her head down and her door locked. She'd let Clara in anyway. And when Clara got sick, the cough first, then the fever, then the kind of stillness that isn't sleep, and there was no family and no one else, Marlowe had looked at baby Rose in her secondhand clothes and her secondhand blanket and thought, somebody has to. The problem was Gideon Hale. Gideon, who had found out Clara was dead through the channels men like him always had, and who had shown up at Marlowe's door one evening with 2 men behind him and a very particular kind of smile. He hadn't wanted Rose, not really. Rose was a leverage point, a thing to own, a claim to make on a woman he felt should still be reachable even from beyond her own death. He'd wanted to demonstrate that nothing escaped him. Marlowe had looked at him through the chain on her door and understood, with a clarity she hadn't known she was capable of, that if she handed Rose over, she would be handing her into the same orbit that had killed Clara, that there was no version of that story that ended well for the baby. She'd gone out the window that night with Rose wrapped in every blanket she owned and $47 in her pocket and the address of a church on the south side where a woman she half knew had told her once that they would help you, no questions, if you needed to get somewhere. They'd helped. She'd gotten somewhere. And now she was here, in a small room in Nebraska, with the wind outside and a man's warmth coming from the stove he'd left banked for her at the end of the hall, and she was trying to decide whether safe was something she was allowed to feel yet, or whether she should keep waiting for the other shoe. Rose made a small sound in her sleep. Not a cry. Just the soft murmur of a baby, dreaming whatever babies dream about in those early weeks when the world is still mostly warmth and sound and the smell of the person holding them. Marlowe reached into the wooden box and laid her hand flat on Rose's back, felt the small rise and fall. I've got you, she thought. Whatever comes, I've got you. Outside, the Nebraska wind moved on across the grass and didn't answer, and the lantern in the front window had long since burned itself out, and the house settled into the sounds of a cold night the way all houses do. The creak of wood contracting, the faint tick of the stove, the occasional shift of something in the barn. Marlowe lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about Gideon Hale. He wasn't the kind of man who gave up. She knew that. She'd known it since the night she'd looked at him through the chain on her door, since the moment she'd read the smile on his face for what it was. Not anger, not grief for a dead woman or a lost child, but the particular cold satisfaction of a man who considers other people's lives to be things that happen inside his perimeter, and therefore subject to his management. He would look for her. He was probably already looking. The question was how long she had before he found out which direction she'd gone and what she was going to do about it when he did. She had not answered that question yet. She had been too busy surviving the last 6 weeks to get to the part where she planned the next 6 months. But she was here now, and the door had a lock on it, and there was a man in the next room who had driven 40 minutes in February cold to meet a woman he didn't know, and who had put a wooden box with a blanket in it in the corner of a spare room for a baby he'd never seen, and who had said, "I'm not looking for a particular set of markings," with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who'd thought about it and decided. She didn't know yet what to do with Silas Mercer, but she was beginning to think that might be all right. She closed her eyes. Rose breathed small and steady in the wooden box. The wind moved on. Morning came early on the ranch, earlier than she was used to, the sky going from black to dark blue to a pale gray that was almost lavender before the sun actually broke the horizon. She woke to the sound of Silas moving through the house, not loud, but deliberate. The sounds of a man who'd been doing the same things in the same order for years and saw no reason to be quiet about it when the day needed starting. She fed Rose first, then dressed quickly in the cold and went to the kitchen. He was already there with the stove going and coffee on, and he looked up when she came in without appearing startled, the way some people looked when they'd remembered. Startled, as if they'd forgotten the arrangement. And she thought, he's not pretending. He'd known she was going to be there in the morning. He'd planned for it. "Coffee's hot," he said, and went back to pulling on his barn coat. She poured herself a cup and stood at the window and watched the sun come up over the eastern fields. It was nothing like a city sunrise, no buildings in the way, no smoke, just the whole flat sky going from nothing to something in about 20 minutes of incremental gold. "It does that every morning," Silas said from somewhere behind her. "I know," she said. "I just haven't seen it in a while." She heard him go out the back door. She turned back to the kitchen and started breakfast, and Rose sat in the wooden box watching the ceiling with the deep philosophical attention of someone who has just discovered that ceilings exist, and the stove ticked and the coffee was good, and for a few minutes, maybe the first few minutes in 6 weeks, nothing was wrong. Just a few minutes. Then she caught herself thinking about Gideon Hale again, and the peace went thin, like ice you know better than to trust. She cracked the eggs into the pan and told herself to eat breakfast first. Everything else could wait until after breakfast. The first thing Marlowe learned about ranch work was that it didn't care what you looked like. The fence didn't care. The chickens didn't care. The water pump that needed priming every morning in temperatures that made her fingers go white and stiff inside her gloves, that certainly didn't care. The work came at you regardless, and you either did it or you didn't. And if you didn't, things suffered. Animals went hungry. Water froze in the pipes. The small machinery of a working ranch ground down and eventually stopped. She'd expected to struggle more than she did. Not physically. She'd never had any illusions about that. She was strong in the particular way of women who'd been doing manual labor since they were old enough to be handed a task, and whatever softness her body carried had never interfered with her capacity to work. What she'd expected to struggle with was the learning, the sheer volume of things she didn't know about this life. But it turned out that most ranch work, broken down to its components, was just problem-solving and repetition, and those were two things she understood. By the end of the first week, she had the chicken routine down without being told. By the end of the second, she'd reorganized the pantry and worked out a system for the laundry that saved about 2 hours a week and required only a minor rearrangement of where the washtub sat. Silas came in one afternoon to find her on her knees in the kitchen, her arm elbow-deep in the cavity of the stove, clearing a blockage in the flue that had been causing the thing to draw wrong for what she guessed was several months. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "There was a blockage," she said, without looking up. "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to get to it. I got to it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've got soot on your face," and went back outside. She sat back on her heels and wiped her cheek with the back of her wrist, which accomplished nothing except moving the soot around, and then she laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short one, the kind that escapes before you decide to let it, and went back to work. That was the rhythm of those early weeks. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. Functional. Two people figuring out how to occupy the same space without getting in each other's way, which was harder than it sounded when the space was as small as a frame house in winter with nowhere to go when the wind was up. Rose was the unexpected bridge between them. Marlowe hadn't anticipated that. She'd thought of Rose as her responsibility entirely, her problem to manage, her noise to apologize for, her presence to justify. But Silas had never once suggested that the baby was a burden. He'd come home one evening in the third week to find Marlowe exhausted at the kitchen table, with Rose screaming in her arms, having been screaming for the better part of 2 hours for reasons that remained opaque. And he'd stood there for a moment and then said, "Give her here," with the flat practicality of a man issuing a completely reasonable request. Marlowe had looked at him. "I used to help my sister with hers," he said, "before I came out here." She'd handed Rose over with the slightly desperate relief of someone releasing a weight they'd been holding too long. He'd sat down at the table and put Rose against his chest and started talking to her in a low, even voice. Not baby talk, just talk. About the cattle he'd checked on that afternoon and the state of the east fence and what he thought the weather was going to do. And Rose had gone quiet within about 4 minutes, turning her face into his coat with the animal certainty of a creature that has found somewhere warm and decided to stay. Marlowe had put her head down on her arms and breathed. "Thank you," she said, into her own sleeve. "She probably just wanted something different for a while," he said. "Same as anyone." She told him about Gideon Hale on a Sunday evening in March, when the cold had started to ease just enough that you could stand on the porch without it feeling like a punishment. She'd been building up to it for weeks, running through versions in her head, calibrating how much to say and how to say it, trying to find the version that gave him the full picture without sounding like she was asking for more than she'd already asked for. But in the end, it didn't happen the way she'd planned. She came out onto the porch to tell him supper was ready and found him sitting on the step looking out at the fields, and something about the way he was sitting, not tense, not guarded, just present, made her sit down beside him instead of going back inside. "I need to tell you something," she said. He didn't say anything, just waited. She told him about Clara, more than she'd told him in the diner that first morning, the real version, the one with the details she'd been keeping back. She told him about Gideon Hale, what kind of man he was, what he'd done to Clara over 2 years that had taken Clara from a girl with a loud laugh and specific opinions about everything to a woman who flinched when someone raised their voice. She told him about the night she'd gone out the window and why. "He's not going to stop looking," she said. "Men like him don't. It's not about the baby, not really. It's about—" She paused, searching for the word. "Control," proving that he can reach whatever he decides belongs to him. Silas was quiet for a moment. The sun was going down behind the western hills, and the light was doing something complicated across the grass, gold and orange, and the first edge of purple. "You should have told me this sooner," he said. Her stomach dropped. "I know. I'm sorry. Not because I'd have—" He stopped, started again. "Not because it changes anything. Just because you've been carrying it by yourself this whole time, and you didn't have to." She looked at him. "He comes here," Silas said. "He'll find out this isn't Chicago. A man can't just walk onto another man's land out here and make demands. The law has something to say about that. The law doesn't always—" "I know it doesn't always." His voice was even. "I'm not talking about what the law does on its own. I'm talking about what we do when we have to." She thought about what that meant, sitting on the porch with the evening coming on and the cattle moving somewhere in the near pasture with that particular low sound they made when the light changed. She thought about what it felt like to have someone say "we" in relation to a problem that had been hers alone for 6 weeks, that had felt like 6 years. It didn't fix anything. Gideon Hale was still out there and the problem of him was still real. But the weight of it had shifted, just slightly, from one side to the other, and the difference was more than she'd expected. "All right," she said. He nodded. "Good. Now, come inside. I can smell those biscuits from here, and I've been thinking about them since noon." She snorted, got up, went inside. Spring came to the ranch the way it came everywhere on the plains. Not all at once, but in arguments, warm days followed by cold snaps, the grass going green along the creek, and then getting frosted overnight. Wildflowers that pushed up only to get beaten down and push up again. Marlowe found she liked the fighting quality of it, the refusal to simply give in. She planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house, which nobody had asked her to do, but which she'd decided needed doing. The soil there was better than she'd expected. Silas told her, when she mentioned it, that his mother had gardened there once, a long time ago, before the ranch had been just his father's and then just his. She found that piece of information interesting and set it aside to think about later. Deke thawed toward her approximately the way the ground thawed in March, in increments, reluctantly, and with occasional setbacks. The morning she brought him coffee out to the barn, where he was dealing with a difficult breech birth in one of the cows. Without being asked and without making conversation about it, she'd apparently passed some threshold she hadn't known existed, because after that he started saying good morning when she came out to feed the chickens. And once he told her that her pie was not bad, which she'd later learned from Silas was the highest praise Deke gave to anything that wasn't a fence post. People in town were a different matter. The first time she went into Caldwell Creek alone, Silas had needed her to pick up a part he'd ordered from the hardware supplier. She'd felt it the moment she walked in. Not hostility, exactly. More like the particular quality of attention that a place gives to something that doesn't quite fit its expectations. The hardware man, whose name was Boyle, had looked her up and down with the practiced economy of a man used to taking quick inventory of strangers, and she'd watched his assessment complete itself and land on a conclusion she knew by heart. She was big, she was young, she was alone. "You're the woman out at the Mercer place," he said. "That's right." Silas's... He paused, and the pause was doing a lot of work. His housekeeper? "I'm the woman out at the Mercer place," she said, and held his gaze without blinking until he looked down at the counter. Silas ordered a pulley assembly for the barn lift. It should have come in last week. He found it. She paid and left, and didn't let herself think about it until she was in the wagon on the way back. And then she allowed herself to feel it for about 10 minutes. The low familiar heat of being seen as less than. And then she put it away, because there was work to do and Rose needed feeding, and the garden wasn't going to weed itself. There were women in town who were friendlier. A woman named Ada Poole, who ran the dry goods store, and who asked direct questions rather than letting her eyes do the asking. A doctor's wife named Frances Halloran, who had known Silas for years, and who gave Marlowe a long, careful look the first time they met, and then said, "He seems better," as if that settled something for her. These women she could work with. But the whispers followed her. She heard them in the way whispers always travel. Not directly, but refracted, showing up in the slight hesitation before someone greeted her, in the too careful way a conversation might change direction when she walked into it. "Did you hear?" The woman he brought in. And then the rest of it, the shape of a woman described in the language people use when they're trying to say that a thing is out of place. She didn't hide from it. That was the decision she'd made somewhere around the third or fourth time she'd walked into Hetty's diner and felt the temperature of the room shift. She could have ordered her coffee and sat in the corner and waited for it to be done. She could have made herself small and quiet and tried not to draw the attention that drew the judgment. She'd done both of those things before, in other places, and she knew where they led. To a version of herself that was permanently apologetic, permanently braced, permanently smaller than she actually was. She was done being smaller than she actually was. She walked into Hetty's and she sat at whatever table she felt like sitting at, and she said good morning to people who weren't sure whether to say it back, and she helped Frances Halloran carry a heavy package to her wagon without being asked, and she argued pleasantly but firmly with Boyle at the hardware store about whether a certain grade of bolt was appropriate for the barn repair she was planning. She existed plainly and persistently in the space she was in. People adjusted, slowly, imperfectly, with occasional backsliding, but they adjusted. The proposal happened in June, which she would later recognize as exactly the right amount of time for two cautious people to figure out that they'd already decided. They'd been out in the east pasture, the two of them and Rose, who had recently discovered that grass existed and was engaged in a prolonged investigation of a particular clump of it. Silas had been looking at the fence line, and Marlowe had been watching Rose with the particular vigilance of someone who knows that a 4, almost 5-month-old can get into trouble in ways that seem physically impossible. "I've been thinking," Silas said, which was how he started most things he'd been working up to. "About?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence. Then he turned and looked at her instead. "About making this official." She waited. He rubbed the back of his neck, which she'd noticed was what he did when something was costing him more effort than he expected. The arrangement. What we're doing here. I think it should be official. You're asking me to marry you, she said. Yes. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the particular expression she'd learned to read over the last 4 months. Not performing certainty, just stating it, the way he stated most things, as a position he'd arrived at after thinking about it and wasn't planning to walk back from. You're not doing this because you feel sorry for me, she said. It wasn't quite a question. No, he said. I'm doing it because the ranch runs better and I sleep better and Rose is... He glanced at the baby, who had apparently concluded her investigation of the grass clump and was now attempting to eat it. He crossed the few feet between them and extracted the grass from Rose's fist without making a production of it. She needs this to be solid, he said, and so do I. Marlowe watched him hold Rose with the easy competence of a man who'd stopped thinking about it weeks ago, when it had apparently become simply a thing he did, and she thought about the wooden box with the blanket in it, and the evening on the porch when he'd said we, and every morning since then when she'd woken up in a house that felt, improbably and incrementally, like hers. All right, she said. He looked up. All right, yes? All right, yes, she said. He nodded, looked back at Rose. Good, he said, and the word came out slightly different than usual, like something inside it had been held tight for a while and had just let go. It wasn't romantic in the way that the word romantic usually meant. There were no speeches and no flowers. It was June, and she could have picked him a dozen wildflowers from the pasture, but that had not been the moment for it. It was simply two people in a field deciding to stop pretending that what they'd built didn't mean what it meant. That was enough. More than enough. The wedding itself was quiet 3 weeks later at the county courthouse in the town of Harlan, which was larger than Caldwell Creek, and had an actual judge. Francis Halloran came, and ate a pool, and Deke stood in the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man attending a funeral who has been informed at the last minute that it is actually a party. Silas wore a clean shirt. Marlowe wore the best dress she owned, which was blue and which she'd let out slightly at the seams to account for the fact that she was not going to make herself uncomfortable on her own wedding day. It took about 12 minutes. On the way home in the wagon, with Rose asleep between them, Silas reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on her knee, briefly, and then put it back on the reins. She looked at the road ahead of them, at the way the late afternoon light lay across the Nebraska grass like it was made of copper, and thought that this was the kind of happiness that didn't announce itself, just settled in quietly, the way the light did, and made everything it touched look different. The news came in August, delivered by a letter that arrived at the Caldwell Creek post office and was handed over by the postmaster to Silas, who brought it home without opening it because the return address was in Chicago and he knew it wasn't for him. Marlowe opened it at the kitchen table while Silas stood at the window with his back to her, giving her the privacy of the reading without actually leaving the room. It was from a woman named Vera Potts, who had been Clara's upstairs neighbor and who had helped Marlowe get to the church on the south side on the night she'd gone out the window. Vera was not much for writing. The letter was short and slightly misspelled and had clearly cost her some effort. But she was clear enough about the important part. He has been asking around about you. He found out you went west. I don't know how much more he knows, but I thought you should hear it from me first. He is not the kind to let a thing go, Marlowe. You know that better than I do. Be careful. Marlowe put the letter down on the table. How bad, Silas said, still at the window. He knows I went west, she said. That's all she knows. He turned around. His face was the careful, deliberate kind of quiet that she'd come to understand meant he was angry and choosing what to do with it. That narrows it to half a continent, he said. He's resourceful. And he has money. She picked the letter up again, put it down again. He'll narrow it further. How long do you think we have? She thought about Gideon Hale, the way he'd smiled through her chain door that night. The two men behind him, not enforcers exactly, more like a vocabulary. A way of saying I travel with consequences. The cut of his coat and the shine of his boots, and the absolute certainty of a man who'd never in his life had to accept that something he wanted wasn't going to come to him. I don't know, she said. Weeks, maybe. If he's been asking since I left, he might already have more than Vera knows. She looked up. Silas, if he gets here, he's welcome to come, Silas said. There was something in his voice that was very flat and very calm. We'll be ready. That's not... She stopped, tried again. He'll try to take Rose, whatever it takes. He'll go through whoever's in the way. Silas sat down across from her at the table. He folded his hands on the surface and looked at her with the steady, full attention that she'd come to rely on without realizing she'd been doing it. Then we take that option away from him, he said. How? I've been talking to the county judge, the man who married us, Holt. He's a reasonable man. There's a legal process for adoption, for what Rose is to us already, on paper. He paused. If the adoption is finalized, anyone who comes for her doesn't have a father's claim anymore. They've got a legal proceeding to fight instead, and legal proceedings leave a record. She stared at him. When were you thinking about this? Since March, he said. Since you told me about him on the porch. He looked slightly uncomfortable, as if he'd been caught in something. I didn't want to say it before you were ready, but I'd been thinking about it. Since March. She told him on a Sunday evening in March, and she thought she was telling him a terrible thing, handing him a reason to rethink an arrangement he'd agreed to based on incomplete information. And instead he'd gone home that night and started thinking about how to fix it. You could have told me, she said. I know. He picked up the letter, looked at it without reading it, put it down. I wasn't sure you'd want me to handle it. It's not about what I want, she said. It's about Rose. Yes, he said. It is. They looked at each other across the table. Do it, she said. Start the process. Whatever you need from me. Whatever paperwork. I'll go to Harlan on Wednesday, he said. Talk to Holt's clerk. She nodded. Looked at the letter again. Vera's careful, uneven handwriting, the words slightly large the way they got when someone wasn't entirely comfortable with a pen, the ink slightly thick where she'd pressed too hard. A woman who'd risked something to write it. From the next room came the sound of Rose making her current favorite noise, which was not quite a word and not quite not one, a sound she'd started making in the last few weeks that seemed to be her comment on the general state of things. Marlowe pushed back her chair and went to get her. She lifted Rose from the blanket she'd been lying on and settled her against her hip, and Rose grabbed a fistful of Marlowe's collar and held on with the focused grip of someone who's decided they're not going anywhere. And Marlowe stood in the doorway between the parlor and the kitchen and looked at Silas, who was still at the table with his hands folded and his jaw set, and thought, we are going to have to fight for this. This is not over. But she also thought we. Still that word, still meaning what it meant. She went back into the kitchen and started supper, with Rose on her hip and the letter on the table and the August evening coming in through the window, and the ranch going on all around them the way it did. Indifferent to trouble, indifferent to fear, just asking to be worked and tended and kept going. She could do that. She had been doing that since the second morning, and she intended to keep doing it regardless of what Gideon Hale thought was his to take. The adoption papers came back from Harlan in the second week of September, stamped and signed and carrying the seal of the county court, and Silas set them on the kitchen table without ceremony and said, "It's done," and Marlowe picked them up and read through them twice before she put them down. Rose Mercer. That was what the papers said. Not Rose of uncertain parentage, not Rose in the temporary custody of, not Rose pending further proceedings. Rose Mercer, daughter of Silas Mercer and Marlowe Mercer, née Bennett, of Caldwell Creek, Nebraska Territory. Marlowe had not expected to feel it as physically as she did. A loosening somewhere in her chest, like something that had been wound tight for so long she'd forgotten it was wound, finally finding slack. She pressed her palm flat on the papers and breathed. "You all right?" Silas said. "Yes," she said. Then, "No, I don't know." She looked up. "Both." He nodded, like that made complete sense, which she supposed it did. Rose herself was indifferent to her new legal status. She was 11 months old and had recently discovered that she could pull herself upright by grabbing onto the legs of the kitchen table, and this achievement occupied the vast majority of her attention. She grabbed, she pulled, she stood for approximately 4 seconds with the concentrated expression of someone diffusing something dangerous, and then she sat down hard and looked around to see if anyone had witnessed the miracle. Marlowe watched her and thought, "Nobody is taking you anywhere." The thought was simple and total and left no room for qualification. October came in colder than the year before, or so Deke said. Though Deke tended to frame each winter as worse than the one before it, in a way that Marlowe had come to think was less meteorological observation than personal philosophy. She spent the month putting up preserves and repairing the gap in the south fence that had been letting the younger cattle wander and arguing with Boyle at the hardware store about whether the nails he'd sold her were the gauge she'd asked for, which they were not. She was getting better at the arguing, not louder. She'd never had much use for loud, but more precise, more willing to hold her ground until the other person ran out of ways to avoid the point. Boyle, after their third or fourth disagreement, had started having the right items ready when he saw her wagon coming down the street, which she took as a reasonable outcome. Silas watched this development with the expression he sometimes wore when she did something that surprised him, which was not a look of surprise exactly, but more of a quiet recalibration, like a man adjusting a figure he'd had in his head and finding it needed to go higher. She caught him wearing that expression one afternoon in early October, when she came back from town with the wagon loaded and proceeded to unload it without asking for help, and then went directly to the barn to check on one of the younger cattle that had been favoring her left foreleg, and then came back inside to start supper without appearing to have found any of it exceptional. "What?" she said when she saw his face. "Nothing," he said. "You've got a look." "I don't have a look." "Silas?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I keep thinking I know what you're going to do, and then you do something else." She stirred the pot on the stove. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. It came out simple and direct, the way he said things when he wasn't trying to dress them up. "It's the opposite of a complaint." She didn't say anything to that, but she felt it, the way she felt most things he said. Not immediately on the surface, but in the lower registers, where the things that actually mattered had been living since she was old enough to understand that the world had a particular category prepared for her, and that she was going to spend her life deciding what to do about it. She stirred the pot and let the warmth of the kitchen settle around her and thought, "This is mine. I built this. Not alone, but I built it." That thought would matter more than she knew in the weeks ahead. Teach. The writer appeared on a Tuesday morning in the middle of November, when the first real snow of the season had come down overnight and left everything white and still and honest-looking in the way that snow does before anyone has walked through it. Marlowe was at the window with her coffee when she saw him coming up the track, and something in the way he sat his horse, too upright, too deliberate, with the posture of a man who has rehearsed his entrance, made the coffee go cold in her hands before she'd finished the thought. She knew. Not the face yet, not from this distance. But she knew the shape of it, the particular quality of intention that moved through a man's body when he believed he was arriving somewhere to take something. She set the cup down on the windowsill and went to the back door. "Silas?" she called toward the barn. He came out with a piece of harness in his hand and looked at her face, and then looked toward the track where the rider was coming. He didn't ask. He set the harness on the fence post and came to stand beside her. They watched him come. Gideon Hale was 36 years old, and he looked like money that had been around long enough to stop feeling the need to prove itself. Good coat, good horse, the kind of easy confidence in his bearing that came not from strength exactly, but from the accumulated experience of being the kind of man that other men stepped aside for. He was not large, average height, lean, but he had the quality of taking up more space than he occupied, the way certain men did, as if their certainty had a physical presence separate from their body. He pulled up in the yard and looked down at the two of them with an expression that was almost pleasant, almost warm, almost the face of a man making a reasonable social call. "Marlowe," he said, "you're a hard woman to find." Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she'd expected. "You found me, anyway." "I did." He looked at Silas. "You must be the husband. Gideon Hale." He said his name the way a man sets a card on a table, not aggressive, but definitive, letting it land and watching to see what it did. Silas looked at him with the flat, considering attention he gave to things he was assessing. "I know who you are," he said. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Gideon's expression. He'd expected something different, she thought. Nervousness, deference, the reflexive apology of people who feel caught. Silas's tone was the tone of a man who'd known his guest was coming and had prepared accordingly, and that was not the dynamic Gideon had ridden out here expecting. "Then you know why I'm here," Gideon said. You've come for the child, Silas said. I've come for my daughter. The word daughter was placed with precision. A legal weight applied to 2 syllables. She's not your daughter, Marlowe said. He looked at her then. Really looked. The full directed attention she remembered from Chicago, from the chain door, from every interaction she'd ever had with him, which had always carried underneath it the current of a man reminding a woman of her position relative to his. I have a biological claim, he said, with the gentleness of someone explaining a fact to a person who is having trouble understanding it. Whatever paperwork you've managed to file out here, and a slight pause, a slight tilt of the head that took in the yard and the house and the empty white fields, wherever this is, a biological claim supersedes it. You might want to talk to a lawyer before you say that too many more times, Silas said, because it's not correct. Gideon's eyes moved back to him. The pleasantness in his expression was still there, but it was working harder now. Excuse me. The child was legally adopted 2 months ago through the county court in Harlan, duly filed and sealed. Her name is Rose Mercer. Silas's voice had not changed in tone or pace. It was the same voice he used to describe the state of the East Fence. Her father's name is Silas Mercer. That's me. Her mother is Marlowe Mercer. You've met her. If you have a claim to make, you'll need to make it in front of a judge, with a lawyer, and you'll be making it against a legal adoption that was properly executed under territorial law. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a man has walked into a room expecting one arrangement of furniture and found it entirely different. Gideon looked at Marlowe. She held his gaze. She had thought about this moment, thought about it in the middle of the night, thought about it doing the washing, thought about it with her hands in the dirt of the kitchen garden while Rose sat nearby and grabbed at everything within reach. She'd thought about what she would feel when she finally had to stand in front of him again. And what she'd mostly imagined was fear, the same fear she'd felt through the chain door in Chicago, the same fear that had gotten her out the window and onto a train with $47 and a baby. What she actually felt was different, not the absence of fear. She wasn't going to insult herself by pretending she wasn't afraid, but something else running alongside it, something harder and older and more durable that had been growing in her through the last 9 months, the way the garden had grown, slowly and without announcement, until one day she'd looked and there was more of it than she'd known was possible. She wasn't going to give an inch, not 1 inch. You should leave now, she said. You've heard what there is to hear. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. There was something happening behind his eyes that she recognized. The recalculation, the adjustment of a strategy that had met unexpected resistance. He was not a man who made scenes in front of witnesses. That was important to understand about him. He did his damage in private, in spaces where there was no one to account to, which was why Clara had been able to hide it for as long as she had. Out here, in a yard, in the daylight, with a man standing 6 feet away who clearly had no intention of moving. This was not Gideon's preferred terrain. This isn't over, he said. The pleasantness was gone now, replaced by something quieter and colder. You know that. I know you think that, Marlowe said. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned his horse slowly, with the deliberateness of a man choosing not to hurry, and rode back down the track the way he'd come. She watched him until he was out of sight. Then her legs went slightly unreliable, not buckling, just reminding her that they were made of ordinary material after all, and she put her hand on the porch rail and held it there. Silas's hand came to rest on her shoulder. Not squeezing, not performing comfort, just there. He'll go to a lawyer, she said. Yes, he said. He has money. He'll find one who'll take the case. Yes, he said again. And we'll find one too. She breathed. The cold air came in clean and sharp, and she let it fill her chest and push back against whatever had taken up residence there. From inside the house she heard Rose, 11 months old and freshly upright and opinionated about most things, making the sound that meant she'd worked herself into a corner she couldn't get out of and expected someone to come deal with it. Marlowe let go of the railing and straightened. I'll get her, she said. The lawyer in Harlan was a man named Aldous Greer, who was 63 years old and had the kind of face that looked like it had heard everything and been surprised by very little of it, and who listened to the full account of the situation over the course of an hour and a half without interrupting except to ask occasional brief clarifying questions that suggested he was tracking more than he appeared to be. At the end of it, he sat back in his chair and looked at them and said, "The adoption is solid. I've seen Holt's work before, and he doesn't leave gaps. But solid doesn't mean uncontestable, especially if Hale finds a lawyer willing to argue biological precedents. Territorial courts are unpredictable on adoption law. We're not dealing with 50 years of established precedent here." "What do we need?" Silas said. "Documentation, evidence of the biological father's character, specifically anything that speaks to his capacity for violence or his pattern of conduct toward the child's mother. Witnesses, if you have them." Greer tapped his pen on the desk. "You're not just defending an adoption, you're painting a picture of why the adoption was necessary in the first place, why returning this child to her biological father would constitute a harm." Marlowe thought of Vera Potts in Chicago, of the letter with its large, careful handwriting, of everything Vera had seen from the apartment upstairs, the sounds she'd certainly heard, the state of Clara's face on mornings after. "I know someone who can speak to his character," she said. Greer looked at her. "Can you get them here?" "I can try." "Try hard," he said. "A first-hand witness who can speak to a documented pattern of violence is worth more in a territorial courtroom than 6 lawyers arguing precedent." She wrote to Vera that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close, trying to explain in writing what she needed and why, and what it would cost in terms of time and travel, and the particular courage required to stand up in front of a room full of strangers and say what she'd seen. She wrote 3 versions before she arrived at one she thought was honest without being frightening, clear without being cold. She didn't tell Vera it would be easy. She'd never once found it useful to tell people that difficult things would be easy. She sealed the letter and gave it to Silas to take to the post office in the morning. And then she sat for a while longer at the table after the lamp had been turned down low, listening to the ranch sleep. The sounds of it, the old familiar creak of the frame settling in the cold, the distant movement of cattle, the soft sound of Rose breathing through the wall. She thought about this look on Gideon Hale's face when Silas had said the words Rose Mercer. The way the pleasantness had had to work harder, the way the calculation had moved behind his eyes. He'd ridden out here expecting a frightened woman and a man he could manage, and he'd found something else entirely, and that had cost him something, even if only the time it took to adjust. He wasn't done. She knew that as well as she knew anything. But she wasn't done either, and that was the part he'd miscalculated from the beginning. Had miscalculated, she suspected, because she was the kind of woman that men like him didn't bother to read carefully. Big and young and female, traveling alone with someone else's baby. He'd looked at the outline of her and drawn his conclusions before she'd opened her mouth. And those conclusions had been so automatic and so total that he'd never thought to revise them. That was his mistake, and she intended to make sure it cost him. Gideon Hale filed his legal challenge in the first week of December through a lawyer in Omaha named Carver, who had the reputation, Aldous Greer told them, of being expensive and thorough and entirely comfortable with moral ambiguity. The hearing was set for February. The months between felt long in the way that waiting always feels long when what you're waiting for is something you can't control. She kept working because work was the only reliable answer she'd ever found to anxiety. Not because it solved anything, but because it occupied the hands and the part of the brain that would otherwise spend its time manufacturing disasters. She repaired the south fence properly this time, with Deke's help and better nails. She kept the garden going through the late fall until the ground finally froze hard and wouldn't yield anymore. And then she planned what she'd plant in spring because the planning felt like a statement of intent. She read Rose to sleep every night from a battered copy of a book of fables she'd found in the bottom of a trunk in the spare room, and whether Rose understood any of it was an open question, but she seemed to like the rhythm of it, her eyes going heavy in that slow, involuntary way that babies had of announcing they were done with the day. Silas was steady in the way she'd learned to depend on him being steady. Not bulletproof, not performing calm he didn't feel, but grounded in a way that didn't easily shift. She heard him some nights, when she woke in the small hours and lay listening to the house, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of something, not moving, just sitting. She never asked what he was thinking about at those hours. She thought she knew, and she thought he needed the space of it, the same way she sometimes needed to sit with the weight of something without having to translate it into words for another person. They were both afraid. That was the honest truth of it, the thing neither of them said directly, but that lived in the house with them the way cold lived in the walls. You couldn't see it, but you felt it when you got too close to certain things. What she didn't feel, not once in all those months, was alone. Vera's reply came in late December. It was longer than her first letter, which had required significant effort from a woman who did not find writing natural or comfortable. Several sentences had been crossed out and rewritten. At one point, there were 3 lines that had clearly been written and then so thoroughly scratched over that they were illegible. Thoughts Vera had started and then decided she wasn't ready for, or that were too much to put in a letter and not enough to leave out. But the important line was there, near the bottom of the second page, and Vera's large, careful hand. I'll come. Tell me when and I'll come. What Clara went through deserves somebody to stand up and say it out loud. And if that somebody has to be me, then that's what I'll do. Marlowe read it twice and then put it down on the table and pressed her hands flat on either side of it and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She thought about Clara, who had been 22 years old and who had laughed loud enough that the sound came through the wall of the apartment, and who had had opinions about everything, sharp, specific opinions that she'd learned to keep mostly to herself by the end, who had shown up at Marlowe's door at 2 a.m. with a split lip and a baby and a look in her eyes that Marlowe recognized. The look of a woman who was out of options she could see. Clara, who deserved someone to stand up and say it out loud. Vera's coming, she called toward the back room, where Silas was going through the account books. She heard the chair scrape. He appeared in the doorway. She'll testify, Marlowe said. Something in his face changed. The particular shift of a man whose calculation of the odds has just improved by a meaningful margin. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, good. I'll write to Greer tonight. I'll write to Greer, she said. You do the accounts. He looked at her. That recalibration expression again, brief and unguarded. Right, he said, and went back to the accounts. She pulled the paper toward her and began to write. With Rose asleep in the next room and the December wind moving against the windows and the lamp making its small, steady circle of light on the table, and the ranch around her going on in its own quiet way, the cattle in the barn, the snow on the fields, the frozen creek, and the bare cottonwoods, and the sky so full of stars on clear nights that it pressed down on you like a weight. She had come here 9 months ago with $47 and a baby that wasn't hers, and a lie she'd been telling herself about what safety meant and where it lived. She had come here certain she'd be found lacking, certain the size of her body and the complexity of her situation would be more than any reasonable man had agreed to take on, certain that she would have to apologize her way through this life the way she had apologized through every other one. She had not found that. She had found work, which she understood. She had found a man who saw her as a person of specific capabilities and responded accordingly, which she had not expected. She had found, incrementally and imperfectly and without fanfare, something that felt like home in the way that home is supposed to feel. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's yours and you've put something real of yourself into it. She was not going to lose it. Not to Gideon Hale, not to a lawyer named Carver, not to a courtroom in a town she'd never visited. She finished the letter to Greer, folded it, sealed it, set it on the corner of the table to go out in the morning with Silas. Then she went to check on Rose. She was asleep on her back with her arms out at her sides in the total abandon that babies slept with, like they'd decided to take up as much space as possible and the world could accommodate itself accordingly. Her breathing was the slow, steady breathing of someone with nothing to worry about, and Marlowe stood in the doorway for a while just watching it. Rose Mercer, she thought, daughter of Silas Mercer and Marlowe Mercer. The county court said so. It was stamped and sealed and filed. But more than that, more than any stamp or seal, it was true in the way that the things you chose, the things you did every day with full knowledge of the cost, were true. It was true in the wooden box with the blanket in it. It was true in 9 months of feedings and fussings and the slow revelation of a small person's personality, her opinions, and her stubbornness and the specific way she grabbed things she wanted with both hands and held on. It was true because Marlowe had gone out a window for her, and because Silas had made a box, And because Vera Potts was going to get on a train from Chicago in February to stand in a courtroom and say what she'd seen. Some truths you had to fight for. This one was worth fighting for. She pulled the door partway closed and went back to the kitchen and turned down the lamp, and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds around her. And somewhere in the north the wind was coming, and February was still 2 months away, and there was a great deal yet to get through. She was ready. February came in hard, the way it always did on the plains. Not gradually, not with any courtesy of transition. Just a drop in temperature that arrived overnight and stayed, the sky going the color of old pewter, and the wind finding every gap in every wall it hadn't bothered with in the milder months. The track to Harlan was passable, but only barely, and Silas drove the wagon with the careful attention of a man who'd done it before in worse conditions and knew exactly where the track got unreliable near the second creek crossing. Marlowe sat beside him with Rose on her lap, bundled so thoroughly against the cold that only her face was visible, and watched the frozen fields go past and tried to keep her mind on practical things. The list of what Greer had told them to bring, the order in which he intended to call witnesses. The particular questions that Carver, Gideon's lawyer, was likely to raise and the answers she'd been rehearsing in her head for 6 weeks. She had not slept well. She hadn't told Silas that because he hadn't slept well either, and she saw no reason for them to sit in the dark together comparing their anxieties. But she'd lain awake most of the last 3 nights going through the thing from different angles the way you worry at a knot. Not productively, just compulsively, the mind refusing to accept that there was nothing more it could do at 2 a.m. than it had already done in daylight. Rose fell asleep against her chest somewhere between the ranch and the first crossing, which was the most peaceful thing in the wagon by a considerable distance. "You're quiet," Silas said. "I'm always quiet." "You're quiet differently today." She looked at him. He was watching the track with the focused attention driving in bad conditions required, but some part of his attention was on her. She'd learned to read that, the way he could be doing one thing and still tracking another. "I keep thinking about what Carver is going to say," she said. "About me. He's going to say you're an unfit mother, that you deceived his client, that you took a child across state lines without legal standing." Silas's voice was level. "We know all of this. Greer knows all of this. Knowing it and sitting there while someone says it in front of a room full of people are different things." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "they are." She appreciated that he didn't try to improve on that. Didn't tell her it wouldn't be as bad as she feared, or that she was stronger than she knew, or any of the other things people said when they wanted to make themselves feel better about someone else's difficulty. He just acknowledged it and kept driving, and that was, she had come to understand, one of the most consistently valuable things about him. Harlan was 2 hours from Caldwell Creek, and they arrived with enough time to leave Rose with Frances Halloran, who had driven out the day before specifically to help, and who took the baby with the competent ease of a woman who had raised 4 children and found a 5th entirely manageable. Vera Potts was already at the boarding house where Greer had arranged rooms. She'd come in on the train from Chicago 2 days before, and Marlowe had seen her briefly that first evening, the two of them sitting in the small parlor of the boarding house while Vera told her what she planned to say, and Marlowe listened and tried to hold herself together. Vera was 41 years old and built like someone who had worked hard all her life and expected to keep doing so. She had gray-brown hair and the kind of face that didn't soften easily but that, when it did, meant something. She'd brought her coat and her good shoes and a written account of what she'd witnessed over 2 years of living above Clara's apartment, which Greer had told her to have ready in case she needed to refer to it. "You don't have to do this," Marlowe had said that first evening. "I know I don't have to," Vera said. She looked at her hands in her lap, then back up. "I did nothing for 2 years. I heard things, and I didn't do anything, because it wasn't my business, and I had my own problems, and I told myself she'd leave when she was ready." She paused. "She wasn't ready in time, so now I'm doing this." Marlowe hadn't said anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. The courtroom in Harlan was a single large room on the second floor of the county building, with tall windows that let in a gray winter light and rows of wooden benches that were, by 8:30 in the morning, already more than half full. She hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected people to come for this. But she supposed a custody dispute involving an out-of-state plaintiff and a legal adoption had the quality of a story, and stories drew people. She felt every eye in the room when she walked in. She was used to being looked at. She'd been looked at her entire life, and she had built, over 24 years, a reasonably functional relationship with the experience. She knew how to walk into a room and not let what she felt on the inside show up in her shoulders or her stride. She'd learned that from her aunt, who had been a large woman in a world that treated large women as problems to be managed, and who had responded by developing a posture that suggested the world could reorganize itself to accommodate her rather than the other way around. She walked in straight, with Silas beside her, and she sat down at the table where Greer was waiting, and she put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Gideon Hale was already at the opposing table. He was dressed better than he'd been in the yard in November. A proper suit, the kind that a man wore when he understood that appearances mattered to rooms full of strangers. His lawyer, Carver, was a heavy-set man with a precise mustache and the settled manner of someone accustomed to winning on points rather than passion. He was going through papers with the focused attention of a man who had done this enough times that the papers were the most interesting thing in the room. Gideon caught her eye across the room. He smiled. Not broadly, just a slight adjustment of his expression, the same smile she remembered from through the chain door in Chicago. The smile of a man who believes the outcome is already settled and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. She looked away. Looked at Greer's papers instead, the ordered stack of documents representing 9 months of her life, distilled into the language courts understood. Judge Holt took the bench at 9 o'clock. He was the same man who had married them and who had signed the adoption papers, and he had the face of a man who had presided over enough disagreements to have stopped being surprised by the depth of them. He looked at both tables, looked at the room, set his reading glasses on his nose. "Let's be clear about what we're here for," he said, before either lawyer could begin. "This is not a criminal proceeding. This court has been asked to review a duly executed adoption and determine whether it should stand. I will hear from both parties. I will not hear speeches. I will not hear testimony about anything that doesn't bear directly on the question of this child's welfare and the legitimacy of the proceedings that brought us here." He looked at Carver. "Mr. Carver, you may proceed." Carver was good. She'd been told he was good, and he was. He opened by framing Gideon Hale as a man of means and stability who had been denied knowledge of his daughter's existence, and then, upon discovering it, had been systematically obstructed from exercising his natural rights. He was careful with his language. He didn't call Marlowe a thief, but he used the word removed in a way that implied it. He didn't call the adoption fraudulent, but he raised questions about whether the court had been in possession of all relevant facts at the time of execution. Then he called Gideon to the stand. Gideon was, she had to admit, an effective witness for himself. He knew how to modulate his voice, how to look at the judge with the expression of a man who has been wronged, but is trying very hard to be reasonable about it. He spoke about Clara with a grief that sounded almost genuine. He spoke about learning of Rose's existence after Clara's death, conveniently omitting the part where he'd shown up at Marlowe's door with 2 men behind him, and about his desire to provide for his biological daughter the kind of stability that he, as a man of means, was uniquely positioned to offer. "Do you love this child?" Carver asked. "I do," Gideon said. "She's my blood. She's all I have left of her mother." Marlowe kept her face still. She looked at Silas beside her. His jaw was set, and his eyes were on Gideon with the particular expression of a man listening to a thing that he knows is wrong, but is not going to respond to out of turn. Under the table, his hand found hers briefly, pressed once, and withdrew. Then Greer cross-examined. Greer was not flashy. He was methodical in the way of a man who had decided that the facts were on his side, and that his job was to get out of the way and let the facts speak. He asked Gideon about the night of Clara's death. He asked whether Gideon had attended the funeral. He asked whether Gideon had made any financial provision for the infant in the weeks between Clara's death and Marlowe's departure from Chicago. The answer to all 3 was no, delivered with explanations that were plausible and smooth, and that Greer did not argue with, simply noted. Then he asked, "Mr. Hale, when you arrived at Miss Bennett's, at Mrs. Mercer's apartment on the evening of November 14th of last year, how many men accompanied you?" A pause, barely perceptible. "I went alone," Gideon said. "You're certain?" "Completely." Greer looked at him for a moment, then said, "Thank you," and sat down. She didn't know what that meant, not yet, but she recognized the quality of that pause, the tiny hesitation of a man who has given an answer he's committed to and is hoping no one can prove otherwise. "To?" Carver called her next. She walked to the stand and sat down and looked at the room, at the faces on the benches, at Silas, who was watching her with the steady attention that she'd come to rely on without quite realizing she'd done it, at Gideon at his table, who was watching her with the pleasant, closed expression of a man who has confidence in his next move. Carver began pleasantly. Her name, her age, her origins in Chicago, how long she had known Clara Marsh. Then, "Mrs. Mercer, would you describe yourself as a close friend of the deceased?" "Yes," she said. "And yet, despite that friendship, you left Chicago with the deceased's infant daughter without notifying any of the child's surviving family?" "There was no surviving family to notify," she said, "except for Mr. Hale. And I had seen firsthand what Mr. Hale's involvement in that child's life would mean." "Firsthand," Carver repeated, as if the word interested him. "You witnessed Mr. Hale behave violently toward Clara Marsh?" "I witnessed the aftermath," she said, "many times. But you did not witness any act of violence directly." The split lips were fairly self-explanatory. A ripple through the room. She hadn't planned to say it that way. It had come out of some part of her that was tired of the careful construction of language around brutal facts. Greer was very still at their table. Holt looked at her over his glasses without expression. "Mrs. Mercer," Carver said, and now the pleasantness had a blade in it. "Let's speak about your own circumstances when you undertook to care for this child. You were unmarried at the time, employed at a laundry, living in a 2-room tenement apartment." Another pause. And here it was, the thing she'd been waiting for, the inventory. "And you are, would you characterize yourself as a woman in good physical health?" She understood exactly what he was doing. She had understood it was coming. "Yes," she said. "No chronic conditions? No limitations on your ability to care for an infant?" "None." "I ask only because the court should be aware," Carver said, turning slightly toward the judge, "that a woman in Mrs. Mercer's physical situation might face challenges that a man of Mr. Hale's means could address. Better medical care, better nutrition, better—" "Her name is Rose Mercer," Marlowe said. Carver stopped. "You've referred to her twice as the child and once as the infant," Marlowe said. Her voice was steady. She had not planned this either, but she was not going to let him abstract Rose into a category. "Her name is Rose Mercer. She is 13 months old. She has 3 teeth, and she says something that is almost certainly the word more when she wants something, and she has her mother's mouth." She stopped. "Clara's mouth. She looks like her mother." The room was very quiet. Holt looked at her. Then he looked at Carver. "Continue," he said, in a tone that suggested Carver might want to choose his next direction carefully. Carver recalibrated. He moved away from the physical territory, not gracefully, but efficiently, and turned toward the question of the adoption itself. Had Marlowe disclosed to Judge Holt the identity of the biological father at the time of application? She said she had identified the father as a man who posed a danger to the child's welfare, which the court records would confirm. Had she disclosed that the father was a man of means who might contest the proceeding? She said she had disclosed everything the proceeding required her to disclose. He sat down. Greer stood. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "on the evening you left Chicago with Rose, did you have a plan?" She thought about the window, the $47, the cold, and the baby wrapped in every blanket she owned. "Not much of one," she said. "What did you have?" She looked at him, then at the room, at the faces watching her, some curious, some skeptical, some with the cautious attention of people who were trying to make up their minds. "I had the baby," she said, "and I knew that if I handed her to Gideon Hale, she'd end up the way her mother ended up. That's what I had. That was enough to get me moving." Greer nodded once. "Thank you," he said, and sat down. Adengat. Vera took the stand after the midday recess. She was not a comfortable public speaker. That was clear from the moment she sat down. The set of her shoulders, the way her hands rested on her thighs with the deliberate stillness of someone trying to keep them from moving. She was nervous in the ordinary human way, not performing it, and Marlowe thought that was probably better than if she'd been smooth about it. Greer took her through it carefully, the way you take someone carefully down a path they're not sure about. Slowly, with attention to where they were putting their feet. She described the apartment building on Halsted Street, the way sound traveled in a building like that, through the floors and the thin walls, the particular acoustics of a structure that had been built without much concern for privacy. She described what she had heard over 2 years of living above Clara Marsh's apartment. She did not use euphemisms. She said what she had heard, in plain language, and the room was very quiet while she said it. On how many occasions would you estimate you witnessed evidence of this pattern? Greer asked. I stopped counting at 30, Vera said. That was in the first year. Did you ever speak to Miss Marsh about what you had observed? Once. Vera's hands moved slightly in her lap, then stilled again. She told me she was handling it. She stopped. She looked like someone who knows the barn's on fire, but has decided the best thing is to stay inside anyway. Like she'd run out of doors. And the night of November 14th, Greer said, the evening Mrs. Mercer left Chicago with the infant. Did you observe anything that evening? I observed Mr. Hale arrive at the building with 2 other men, Vera said. The room shifted. She felt it. The slight collective adjustment of people who have just heard something that contradicts something else they've already been told. Across the room, Gideon Hale was looking at Vera with an expression she recognized from the yard in November. The recalculation. The rapid assessment of a man determining how much damage has been done and what can still be managed. Carver objected. Greer responded. Holt sustained in part and overruled in part, and told Vera to continue to what she had directly observed. 3 men arrived, Vera said again, plainly. Mr. Hale and 2 others. They were inside the building for about 20 minutes. When they left, I looked out my window. The alley was clear. But I checked Marlowe's room the next morning, and she was gone. She paused. I wasn't surprised. Carver's cross-examination of Vera was vigorous and not entirely without effect. He raised questions about the reliability of sound as evidence, about the distance between floors, about whether Vera had any direct personal animosity toward Gideon Hale. Vera answered each question with the dogged patience of a woman who had decided she was going to say what she'd come to say and was not going to be made to feel wrong about it. She didn't get rattled. She got, if anything, quieter, which turned out to be more unsettling than if she'd gotten loud. When Carver sat down, she looked straight ahead until Holt dismissed her. Silas was the last witness Greer called. She hadn't fully anticipated what it would feel like to watch him walk to the stand. She'd watched him work and eat and sleep and argue mildly with Deke about the proper way to repair a particular kind of post. And she knew the specific way he moved through the world. The efficient purposefulness of a man who had learned early that space and energy were resources not to be wasted. She knew the sound of his voice in the morning before he'd said enough words to fully warm it up, and the quality of his silences, which varied in ways she'd learned to distinguish. She knew him. She had not thought about how he would look in a courtroom, testifying to a room full of strangers about why he was a father. Greer started with the practical, the ranch, the adoption proceedings, the legal and financial stability he could offer, the work they had done together, she and he, in the last year, and what the ranch had become because of it. Then he said, Mr. Mercer, tell the court what it means to be Rose's father. Silas was quiet for a moment. He wasn't the kind of man who talked without thinking first, and he didn't hurry now because the room was waiting. When she was sick last September, he said, she had a fever that lasted 2 days. Marlowe and I took turns through the nights sitting up with her, keeping the cloth on her head changed out, watching to see if we needed to go for the doctor. On the second night, around 3 a.m, the fever broke. Rose looked up at me. She wasn't quite a year old, she couldn't say anything, but she looked up and she grabbed my finger. He paused. That's what it means. The room was very still. I didn't make her, he said. I know that. But I've been there every morning since February, and I intend to be there every morning after this, and I don't know what word you want to use for that, but the word I use is father. Carver's cross-examination was brief. He asked about Silas's income, about the ranch's debts, which were modest but real, about whether Silas had any previous experience with children. Silas answered each question without embellishment and without defensiveness, and the answers were neither perfect nor disqualifying, and Carver seemed to understand fairly quickly that he was not going to dislodge this particular witness with financial questions. He tried one more angle. Mr. Mercer, you knew, when you responded to Miss Bennett's letter, that she was fleeing a difficult situation, correct? She told me she was in a difficult situation she couldn't fully explain in a letter, Silas said. Yes. Didn't that concern you, that a woman you'd never met was concealing the details of her circumstances from you? Silas looked at him. She told me what she could, he said. She was protecting a child from a dangerous man, and she didn't know if she could trust me yet. That's not concealment, that's judgment. Carver paused. You believe that? I know it, Silas said, because I've watched her every day for a year, and everything she does comes from the same place. She's not a woman who does things to benefit herself. She does things because they need doing, and she's the one who's there to do them. Carver sat down. Greer gave his closing argument at 4 o'clock, when the February light had gone thin and gray in the tall windows, and the room had the particular quality of a place that has been full of a difficult thing all day and is now very tired. He did not argue sentiment. He argued law, the soundness of the adoption proceeding, the evidence of the biological father's conduct, the documented pattern of violence that made reunification a harm rather than a remedy, the testimony of an eyewitness who had contradicted the plaintiff's own account of a key evening under oath. The question before this court is not which party has the more compelling story, Greer said. It is which arrangement serves the welfare of this child. The evidence has established that Rose Mercer is healthy, loved, and in the care of 2 people who have demonstrated, consistently and without any expectation of recognition, that they are willing to sacrifice for her. The evidence has also established that the man seeking to disrupt that arrangement has demonstrated consistently a pattern of conduct that no court should place a child into range of. The adoption was sound, the family is real, the court should let it stand. Carver's closing was confident and technical, an argument about biological rights and procedural questions that was well constructed and landed on ears that had spent the day hearing from Vera Potts. Holt called a recess. She sat at the table with Silas and Greer and did not speak. There was nothing to say that hadn't been said, and the saying of things now would only be a way of trying to control something that had passed out of her control the moment Holt left the bench. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. Silas put his hand over hers. She turned her palm up and held on. The recess lasted 40 minutes, which was either a short time or an enormous one depending on what you did with it. She did not move from her chair. She did not look at Gideon Hale's table. She looked at the wall and she thought about Rose, who was with Francis Halloran and was probably attempting to eat something she shouldn't, and she thought about the ranch and the east fence and the kitchen garden that was under the snow right now, but that she'd planned out already for spring, the rose and what would go in them. And she held on to those thoughts because they were real and present and belonging to her, and she needed something to hold on to. Holt returned. The room went very quiet. He settled himself and looked at his papers, and then looked at the room, and then he began. He was deliberate and he was precise, and he did not use more words than the situation required. He acknowledged the biological claim. He acknowledged the questions Carver had raised about the adoption proceeding. He noted that those questions, while not frivolous, had not risen to the level of demonstrating any material irregularity in the proceeding. Then he turned to the evidence of conduct. He said that the testimony of Vera Potts was credible, specific, and corroborated in material detail by physical records from the county clerk's office regarding the building in question. He said that the contradiction between the plaintiff's testimony and Mrs. Potts's direct observation raised serious questions about the plaintiff's credibility as a witness for himself. He said that the welfare of a child was not an abstraction and could not be adjudicated as one, and that the court was obligated to consider the full picture of what each arrangement meant for a specific living child rather than a theoretical one. He concluded in language that was formal and dry, and that contained underneath its formality the entire weight of the last year of her life. The adoption would stand. Rose Mercer would remain in the custody of Silas and Marlowe Mercer. The plaintiff's petition was denied. Court was adjourned. She heard the gavel. She did not move for a moment. Then Silas's hand tightened on hers, and she turned and looked at him. And his face was the face of a man who has been braced against a weight for a very long time, and has just felt it lift. And something happened behind his eyes that she had not seen there before, and that she didn't have a precise word for, but that she recognized in herself. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder for exactly 3 seconds, because she was in a public room and she was not going to fall apart in it. 3 seconds was allowed. Then she straightened and picked up her coat and turned to find Vera Potts standing a few feet away with her good shoes and her coat and her hands clasped in front of her, looking at Marlowe with an expression that was somewhere between exhaustion and relief. Marlowe crossed to her and took both her hands and didn't say anything for a moment, because what she wanted to say was not something language handled well. "Thank you," she said. "For Clara." Vera's jaw went tight for a moment. Then she nodded, once. "Go get your girl," she said. Gideon Hale was gone before they reached the courtroom door. She didn't see him leave. She only registered his absence the way you register the absence of a sound you've been hearing for so long it had started to feel like weather. Not immediately, and then, all at once, as a kind of pressure lifted. She found out later from Greer that Carver had already been in contact about whether grounds for appeal existed, and that Greer had sent back a reply that had apparently been discouraging enough that no further correspondence followed. Whether Gideon Hale would be discouraging enough to stay gone was a question she couldn't answer yet. She was aware enough of what kind of man he was to know that humiliation sometimes curdled into something worse over time. But that was not today's problem. Today's problem was getting to Frances Halloran's house before the temperature dropped any further, and getting Rose and getting back to the wagon. Simple problems. The best kind. The Halloran house was 3 blocks from the courthouse, and she walked it faster than strictly necessary, with Silas matching her pace. And when Frances opened the door, Rose was on her hip with a piece of bread in one hand and a wooden spoon she'd apparently confiscated from somewhere in the other. And when she saw Marlowe, she dropped the wooden spoon and reached out with both hands in the absolute imperious expectation of someone who has never doubted that the person reaching back would be there. Marlowe took her. She held her tighter than was probably comfortable, and Rose squirmed and made the sound that meant she wanted to see what was going on over Marlowe's shoulder. And Marlowe loosened her grip and let her look, and stood in Frances Halloran's doorway with the February cold coming in and the bread mashed against her coat collar and Rose's weight solid and real in her arms. "Well?" Frances said. "It stands," Silas said from behind her. Frances Halloran let out a breath that might, under different circumstances, have been described as unladylike. "Good," she said. "Come inside and have some coffee before you freeze." They went inside. Rose ate the rest of her bread and looked around the room and found the wooden spoon again and banged it contentedly on the floor. And the coffee was hot and the room was warm, and outside the February afternoon was going dark in that abrupt way it had on the plains, the light just deciding it was done and withdrawing. And Marlowe sat at Frances Halloran's kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup and thought about what came next. Not with dread. Just with the ordinary, forward-looking attention of a person who has gotten through the thing they needed to get through and has not yet decided what to do with the getting. Silas was across the table, talking to Frances in the quiet way he had, and Rose had found his boot and was conducting a detailed investigation of the lace, and the stove was doing its work, and the lamp was lit. And it was, for this moment, enough. More than enough. It was everything. The drive home from Harlan took longer than usual. Not because of the road, which was no worse than it had been that morning, but because neither of them was in a hurry, and the horse seemed to understand that, or at least had no objection to a pace that let the last of the February light do what it wanted across the frozen fields. Rose fell asleep before they reached the first creek crossing, wedged between them on the bench with her head against Marlowe's arm and her mouth slightly open in the total unconscious commitment of a child who has decided the day is over. Silas drove. Marlowe watched the darkening sky and let herself be still for the first time in she couldn't remember how long. Not empty. There was still too much in her for empty. But still. The way water goes still after you stop moving through it. "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would," she said after a while. "How did you think it would feel?" She considered. "Finished, I suppose. I thought it would feel finished." He was quiet for a moment, watching the track. "Does it?" "Not exactly." She looked at Rose sleeping against her arm, the small weight of her, The particular way her face went completely unguarded in sleep, in a way it didn't quite manage even in her happiest waking moments. It feels more like the first morning after a long illness, where you're not sick anymore, but you don't quite trust it yet. You keep waiting for the fever to come back. That goes away, Silas said. I know. She did know. She'd been sick enough times in her life, in the other sense of the word, to know that the distrust of good health was temporary, that eventually the body convinced itself the worst was over and relaxed its vigilance. I just haven't gotten there yet. He nodded, drove. The horse moved through the dusk with the steady, untroubled rhythm of an animal that knew the way home and was taking it. You did well today, he said. When she opened her mouth, he added, I'm allowed to say that. She closed her mouth. When Carver was after you, he said, you didn't flinch. I flinched on the inside. That doesn't count. She looked at him. He was watching the road, but there was something in his jaw, some slight relaxation in it that hadn't been there this morning, and she recognized it as the after effect of held tension finally releasing. He'd been carrying it too, the same weight she'd been carrying, and she had not always remembered that as clearly as she should have. Silas, she said. Thank you for all of it. The lawyer, the adoption, She stopped because the list was too long to recite, and also because listing things was not the right form for what she was trying to say. For March, she said instead, for already thinking about it when I told you on the porch, when I thought I was ruining everything by telling you. He glanced at her. You weren't ruining anything. I know that now. You knew it then, he said. You told me anyway. That's not nothing. She looked back at the road ahead, at the darkness gathering in the eastern sky and the last thin line of copper along the west. At the Nebraska winter lying out in all directions, cold and enormous and indifferent, asking nothing of them except that they endure it. She had endured it. More than that, actually. She had planted a garden in it. Spring that year arrived differently than the one before. Not because the weather was any kinder, it wasn't. The March cold snaps came as scheduled, and the late frost took out a portion of what she'd planted along the south wall and required replanting, which she did without excessive complaint because the land didn't owe her anything, and she'd known that going in. But it arrived differently because she was different inside it, the way a place looks different when you finally decided it belongs to you and stopped waiting to be asked to leave. She planted the garden with Rose on a blanket beside her, old enough now to sit unassisted and young enough to find a clump of dirt an object of serious philosophical interest. Rose examined things with a focused intentionality that Marlowe had started to think of as a personality trait. She didn't approach the world casually. She approached it like a small person with a list of questions and no intention of leaving until they'd been answered. You're going to be trouble, Marlowe told her, on a morning in April when Rose had worked out how to open the bottom kitchen cabinet and was systematically removing its contents. Rose looked up at her with the expression of someone who doesn't see what the problem is. That's fine, Marlowe said. I know how to handle trouble. She put the pots back in the cabinet for the fourth time that morning and went back to the bread she was making, and Rose opened the cabinet again, and this was the texture of the days, imperfect and repetitive and occasionally maddening, and underneath all of that, deeply, quietly good. Silas came in at noon and looked at the cabinet standing open and Rose sitting in front of it with the contentment of a general who has taken a hill and intends to hold it. She did it again, Marlowe said. He went to the basin and washed his hands. Deke says she smiled at him this morning. Rose smiles at everyone. Deke doesn't smile at everyone, Silas said. That's the point. She glanced at him. He was drying his hands with the straight face he wore when he'd said something he thought was funny, and was waiting to see if she'd catch it. She had learned to catch it. It had taken a few months, because his humor was so dry it was occasionally indistinguishable from just a statement of fact, but she could read it now. The biscuits will be ready in 20 minutes, she said. I know, he said. I could smell them from the barn. She shook her head and went back to the bread. Ada Poole from the dry goods store came out to the ranch for the first time in May, which in itself was a thing. Ada was not a woman who made social calls lightly. She had a store to run and a husband who required management and strong opinions about how time should be used. But she arrived one afternoon with a jar of preserves and a directness that Marlowe had come to appreciate as one of Ada's most reliable qualities. "I wanted to come before this," Ada said, sitting at the kitchen table while Marlowe made coffee. "After the hearing, I kept starting to and then not." "Why didn't you?" "I wasn't sure what to say." Ada set the preserves on the table and looked at them. "I owe you an apology, is the thing. When you first came, I watched the way people treated you, and I didn't do anything about it. I was polite to you, which isn't the same thing as standing up for someone." Marlowe brought the coffee and sat down across from her. "Ada." "I'm saying it," Ada said. "Let me say it. All right. What Boyle said about you, about the things that got said around town when you first came, I knew they were wrong. I knew from the first week you were here that you were somebody worth knowing, and I kept it to myself because it was easier. And then I watched you hold your head up through all of it, and the hearing, and—" She stopped. "You deserve somebody to say something sooner. I'm sorry I wasn't that person." Marlowe looked at her for a moment. She thought about what it would have meant in those first weeks to have someone say something, how much easier some of it might have been. She was not going to pretend it wouldn't have mattered. But she was also not the same person who'd stepped off the train in February of the year before, half frozen and braced for rejection, doing the complicated arithmetic of how much of herself she could afford to show without it being used against her. "You're here now," Marlowe said. "That counts." Ada looked at her, then she picked up her coffee and said, "The preserves are blackberry. I put up too many last summer." "I can see that," Marlowe said, looking at the jar, which was enormous. "I may have gotten carried away." "Just a little," Ada almost smiled. "Your garden looks good from the road." "It's coming along," Marlowe said. "The late frost set me back on the south side." "Always does," Ada said. "You have to plant a second row of everything along that wall. Double up." "I'll do that." They drank their coffee, and Rose woke from her nap and came in with her hair pressed flat on one side and an immediate opinion about the preserves jar, and Ada held her with the ease of a woman who had done it before and talked to her with the serious attention that Rose apparently required. And Marlowe watched and thought, this is also what it looks like. Not the courthouse. This too. People talked differently about her after the hearing. Not universally, and not without exception. There were still people in Caldwell Creek who looked at her and did the arithmetic and came up with whatever conclusion satisfied them, and she had made her peace with the fact that she was never going to live in a world entirely free of that particular tax. But the quality of the room changed when she walked into it. She'd earned something in that courtroom, and what she'd earned was not charity and not pity. It was the specific regard that a community extends to someone who has been tested by something and not come apart. Boyle had the right items ready when he saw her wagon. Hetty at the diner had taken to saving her the table by the window without being asked. A rancher named Callum, who ran the operation south of the Mercer land, stopped to talk to her one afternoon when she was checking the fence line, and talked to her the way he talked to Silas. As a party, in a conversation, not an audience for one, about the state of the grazing and the price of cattle and what the summer looked like. She did not mistake any of this for love. She was too clear-eyed for that. Communities were not simple, and people were not consistent, and the goodwill of a small frontier town was a resource that came with conditions and could go away again under the right pressures. She'd learned that early enough in her life that it had stopped being a lesson and become simply a fact she navigated around. But it was real, what there was of it. And real, in the imperfect, partial way it came, was sufficient. Silas told her one evening that Callum had asked him whether Marlowe might be willing to advise on Callum's wife's kitchen garden, which had been failing for 3 years in ways Callum couldn't account for. She looked at him across the supper table. "He asked you." "He wasn't sure how to ask you directly," Silas said. "He's old-fashioned." "He should learn to be less old-fashioned." "I told him that," Silas said. "More or less." "What does more or less mean in this case?" It means I said something like, 'My wife knows more about it than I do. You should talk to her,' and he said he'd think about it." She considered this. "All right. You'll do it?" "I'll go look at the garden," she said. "I'm not promising anything about the garden." He nodded, with the small expression she'd learned was his version of satisfaction with how a thing had gone. She went to look at Callum's wife's garden the following week. The wife, whose name was Nora, and who was 26 and had been trying to make things grow in rocky soil with insufficient drainage for 3 summers, met her with the wary hopefulness of someone who has been given bad advice before and is trying to decide whether this is more of the same. Marlowe spent an hour looking at the soil and the drainage and the way the light fell at different times of day, and then she told Nora exactly what she thought, plainly, without softening it or making it feel like a compliment first. The drainage was wrong, the soil needed amendment, and the positioning of the main beds was getting afternoon shade from the barn that was killing 2 hours of growing light every day. Nora was quiet for a moment after all of this. Then she said, "Nobody told me about the shade." "Did you ask?" "I asked Callum. He said it looked fine." Marlowe looked at her. "Men often think gardens look fine when what they mean is they haven't noticed them." Nora laughed. It was a surprise laugh, the kind that gets out before the person has decided to allow it, and after it she looked slightly startled by herself. And then she looked at Marlowe differently than she had at the beginning of the conversation. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said. "Go ahead." "When you came here, last year, were you frightened?" Marlowe thought about the train platform in February, the pewter sky and the enormous cold in the town 2 streets wide, the man walking across the platform toward her and the letter folded against her ribs, and Rose crying for most of Iowa. "Yes," she said, "but you stayed." "I had reasons to stay," Marlowe said, "and I'd run out of places to run to." She paused. "And after a while the reasons got bigger than the fear. That's usually how it works." Nora looked at the rocky, failing garden around them. "I want to fix it," she said. "The garden?" "Then let's fix it," Marlowe said. They worked for 2 hours that afternoon, staking out where the bed should be moved, talking through what would need to happen before the next planting. It was not a transformation. It was the beginning of a plan, which was a different and more honest thing. Marlowe came home with dirt under her nails and the comfortable tiredness of work that had been genuinely useful. And she thought that this, too, was part of what the year had made. Not just herself, surviving. Herself, of use to someone. She found out she was pregnant in June, which was approximately the last thing she'd been thinking about, and also, when she sat with it for a day and let it become real, not a surprise at all. She told Silas on the porch, in the evening, in the same place, and the same quality of light as when she'd told him about Gideon Hale. She noticed that and thought it meant something, that the porch in the evening had become the place where they put the real things, the ones that needed air around them. He was quiet for a moment after she told him. "Say something," she said. "I'm thinking," he said. "That's unhelpful." "Give me a second." He was looking out at the fields, and she watched his face do the thing it did when he was processing something large, the stillness of it, the way he went very internally quiet before he spoke. Then he looked at her. "Are you all right?" "Physically? Yes. I feel terrible, but I've been told that's normal." "That's not what I meant." She knew it wasn't. He meant the larger question, the weight of it, the additional complexity in a life that had already had considerable complexity, the simple fact of being 24 years old and already more responsible for more things than she'd ever expected to be. "I'm all right," she said. And then, more honestly, "I'm scared. But it's a different kind of scared than before. It doesn't feel like the kind of scared where something bad is happening. It just feels like big." He nodded slowly. "It is big." "Yes?" "We'll manage it," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been managing things all year." He looked at her for a moment with the recalibration expression, the one that meant he'd just updated the number upward. "You have," he said. She leaned against his shoulder briefly because the evening was warm and the light was doing something gold across the grass, and she was tired and 24 years old and building a life out of materials she hadn't started with, which was exhausting and also something else, something she didn't have the perfect word for, but that felt, at its center, like rightness. Like the particular rightness of a thing that has been assembled carefully and holds. They sat on the porch until Rose woke from her nap and made her opinions about that known, and then Marlowe went inside to get her, and the evening went on in its ordinary, imperfect way, and the ranch went on around them, and that was, she understood, what living looked like when it was actually going. Walk. The baby came in late February on the first anniversary, near enough of the day Judge Holt had brought down his gavel in the Harlan courtroom. She was a boy, which surprised her. She'd had no particular expectation either way, but had somehow imagined a girl. And he was red-faced and furious about being in the world, which she thought was entirely appropriate given the world's general attitude toward newcomers. They named him Thomas, after Silas's father, who had built the original structure of the ranch, and who had died before Silas had managed to do anything worth showing him. Thomas was a different baby than Rose had been. Rose had been watchful, interior, studying the world with the focused assessment of a scientist. Thomas announced himself at all hours and had opinions about everything immediately, and cried with the full conviction of someone who believed that volume was the primary measure of urgency. "He's loud," Deke said one morning, appearing in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who has been woken at 3 a.m. and is being reasonable about it by a very thin margin. "He's hungry," Marlowe said. She was walking Thomas in a circle around the kitchen, which was the only thing that helped, her arm aching from the weight and her eyes carrying the particular quality of someone who has not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 4 days. "Is he always going to be like this?" "I have no idea," she said honestly. Rose wasn't. Deke looked at Thomas, who had paused his crying to look at Deke with the assessing stare of someone sizing up a new person. Then Thomas resumed crying. "He'll be trouble," Deke said. "I know how to handle trouble," Marlowe said. Deke stood there for another moment, then went back to the bunkhouse. But she noticed in the following weeks that he would sometimes appear in the yard when she had Thomas with her outdoors. Not close, not making conversation, just present in a way that wasn't entirely accidental. Once she came around the corner of the barn and found him holding Thomas at arm's length, with the expression of a man holding something fragile and unpredictable, while Thomas stared up at him with absolute fascination. Deke handed Thomas back the moment he saw her. "He was making noise," Deke said. "I can see that," she said, looking at the baby, who was, in fact, currently not making noise. "He stopped," Deke said, and walked away. She looked at Thomas, who looked back at her with the bright, unfocused attention of a 2-month-old discovering that people were an interesting category. "Don't tell anyone," she told him. Thomas drooled non-committally. 3 years after Marlowe Bennett had stepped off a train at a depot the size of a waiting room, carrying a 4-month-old baby and $47, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been afraid for so long she's forgotten what the alternative feels like, the Mercer Ranch was a different place. Not unrecognizably different. The house was still the same frame house with the peeling paint on the porch posts, though she'd repainted 2 of them herself the previous fall and intended to do the other 2 this spring. The barn was still the barn. The east fence was still the east fence, though it held better now after the proper repair. But the kitchen garden ran along the full length of the south wall now, and in the summer it produced enough that she put up preserves and traded some of it with Nora Callum's household. And Nora's garden had become, over 2 seasons of deliberate intervention, a genuinely productive thing that Nora spoke about with the particular pride of someone who has made something out of difficult material. The cattle herd had grown by 1/3. Silas had made a careful decision in the 2nd year to expand, not recklessly, but with the methodical assessment of a man who had been watching the market long enough to have a reasonable read on it. And the expansion had worked out in the way that careful decisions sometimes did. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, but net positive over the time horizon they'd been thinking about. Deke had stayed. This had not been guaranteed. He was the kind of man who had spent his life reserving the right to leave, and she had understood from the beginning that he would stay only as long as the work suited him and the situation didn't irritate him past his threshold. Somewhere in the 2nd year, he had apparently made some private calculation that had resolved in their favor, because he stopped having the look of a man considering his exit and started having the look of a man who has decided to stay and is just not going to make a production of it. He had opinions about Thomas. Not expressed opinions, not in words, but observable ones, visible in the way he sometimes watched the boy with the sidelong attention of someone trying to figure out what category they were dealing with. Thomas at 18 months was walking and loud and had developed a habit of following Deke around the yard when given the opportunity. Deke had never once encouraged this. He had also never once discouraged it, which Marlowe had come to understand was Deke's version of an open door. Rose, at 3 years old, had become the person Marlowe had suspected she would become from the first week. Deliberate, observant, with the kind of inner stubbornness that didn't announce itself but was always there, like bedrock under the topsoil. She could spend 40 minutes on a single problem that interested her and walk away from one that didn't, with a completeness that suggested she'd simply filed it under not relevant and moved on. She had her mother's mouth, Clara's mouth, the one Marlowe had named in the courtroom, and Silas's particular quality of giving things her full attention when she decided they merited it. She called Silas Papa in the uncomplicated way of a child who has only ever known one answer to that question, and she called Marlowe Mama, and she called Deke the man until she was 2.5, and apparently decided that wasn't adequate and upgraded him to Deke, which he accepted without visible reaction, but which Marlowe had noticed, quietly, had coincided with him letting Rose sit on the fence rail while he worked in the yard, holding her steady with one hand without looking like he was doing it. This was what Marlowe thought about sometimes, when she was in the garden or doing the washing or lying awake in that brief early morning window before Thomas decided the day had started. The accumulation of it. The way life on the ranch was not a story with a clear before and after, but a continuous process of small things building on each other, some of them failing, some of them holding, none of them perfect, all of them real. She thought about Clara. She thought about Clara often, and she had decided not to feel guilty about the fact that the thinking was no longer only grief. It was grief and also something else, something that was harder to name but that had to do with continuity, with the fact that Rose had Clara's mouth and also Marlowe's stubbornness and Silas's attention, and that this combination was becoming daily its own specific person who had never existed before and would not exist without all of the things that had happened to bring her here. She had told Rose about Clara, not in any formal way, not with any prepared speech. She was 3, and 3-year-olds processed information through the particular filter of what was relevant to their immediate experience, but in the way that you wove a person into a child's understanding of where they came from. Your first mama was named Clara. She was funny and she was loud and she loved you from the beginning. Rose had listened with the focused seriousness she brought to things, and then asked if Clara had liked horses, and Marlowe had said she didn't know for sure, but she thought probably yes, and Rose had nodded as if that settled something. It was not enough. It would never be enough, what you could give a child in place of the mother she didn't get to have. But it was something, and something honestly given and honestly maintained was what you could do, and Marlowe had decided that you had to accept that without deciding it made you a failure. Gideon Hale did not come back. She had waited for it, not obsessively, but with the background vigilance of someone who knows what a person like that is capable of over time. In the first year after the hearing, she had watched the road with more attention than it deserved, and had startled twice at riders who turned out to be neighbors with ordinary business and nothing threatening about them. In the second year, she had thought about him less. In the third year, there was a week in September where she realized she had not thought about him once. And this realization was significant enough that she stopped what she was doing and stood in the garden and held it for a moment. Greer had told them, some months after the hearing, that Carver had formally closed the file. Whether this was because Gideon had decided the cost wasn't worth it, or because some other aspect of his life had required his attention, or because a man who operated by controlling the controllable had looked at the Mercer Ranch and concluded it was no longer controllable, she didn't know, and had stopped needing to know. He was a fact of her past that had attempted to become a fact of her future and had failed, and the failing had been documented and sealed and filed away in a courthouse in Harlan, Nebraska territory, in the handwriting of a judge named Holt, who did not leave gaps. That was enough. That was actually everything. On a morning in late April, 3 years and 2 months after her arrival, Marlowe was in the garden when Silas came out of the barn and stood at the fence watching her work. She looked up and saw him watching and said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "You've got to look again." "I don't have a look." "Silas, you always have a look, and you always say you don't have a look." He was quiet for a moment. Behind him in the yard, Thomas was conducting some enterprise involving a stick and a bucket that appeared to be fully absorbing his attention, and Rose was sitting on the fence rail with the careful balance of a child who has practiced it, watching a crow in the cottonwood tree with the focused interest she gave to things that interested her. "I was thinking," Silas said. About, He stopped. This was not his usual deliberateness. This was a man who had found a thing difficult to say and was taking the time to find the words rather than the first words. About what this looks like, from the outside. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. A year ago, I wouldn't have been able to describe it, he said. What I expected it to look like. I thought I knew what the ranch was and what it needed and what kind of life I was going to have out here. He looked out over the fields. I didn't know. No, she said. I'm glad I didn't know, he said. Because if I'd known what I was actually getting, I'd have been afraid to say yes to any of it, and I would have missed. He gestured slightly at the yard, at Rose on the fence, and Thomas and his bucket, and the garden, and the smoke from the chimney, and all of it, the whole improbable accumulated thing. All of this, he said. I would have missed all of this. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her hands. She thought about the letter folded against her ribs on the train. 6 sentences, and the word, honest. She thought about the platform in the pewter February light, and the town 2 streets wide, and the feeling of being at the absolute end of what she'd thought was possible for her. She thought about the wooden box with the blanket in it, sitting in the corner of a room that nobody had warned her she was going to think of as hers. She had spent most of her life being looked at and found wanting. Not by everyone, not at every moment, but often enough and consistently enough that she had constructed around herself a kind of interior architecture designed to survive it, a set of load-bearing walls built to hold up under the weight of other people's conclusions about what she was worth and what she deserved and what kind of life was appropriate for a woman of her particular dimensions. She had built that architecture carefully and maintained it well. What she had not anticipated was that it would turn out to be unnecessary out here. Not because the world had become kind. The world was not kind. It was imperfect and sometimes cruel and full of people who would draw their conclusions before you opened your mouth, and she had never been naive enough to think otherwise. But because she had found, in the building of this specific life, that the load-bearing walls she'd needed in the old life were not what held things up in this one. What held things up here was different. It was the work, daily and unglamorous. It was the fence repaired properly with the right nails. It was the garden doubled along the south wall after the late frost took out the first row. It was the letter written honestly to a man she'd never met, telling him things that might have made him close the door, and the extraordinary fact of the door not closing. It was Rose on the fence rail watching the crow. It was Thomas and his bucket. It was Deke holding Thomas at arm's length with the expression of a man who will deny this later. It was Ada Poole's apology and Vera Potts saying, "Go get your girl," and Frances Halloran's coffee, and Nora Callum's fixed garden, and the crow in the cottonwood tree, which had apparently decided something and was flying off now in the direct way of things that know where they're going. It was Silas looking at her across a fence in late April and saying, "I would have missed all of this." It was her standing in a garden in Nebraska with dirt on her hands, knowing exactly what she was worth. "I should have been afraid too," she said, "getting on that train. I should have been more afraid than I was." "Why weren't you?" She thought about it honestly. "Because I'd already lost everything I was afraid of losing," she said. "There wasn't much left to protect, so I just went, and then I kept going." She looked at him. "I didn't know it would turn out to be the right direction." "You made it the right direction," he said. She shook her head. "We did." He accepted that with the small nod of a man who knows when the argument is over and is fine with where it landed. Rose called from the fence, "Mama, the crow is gone." "I see that," Marlowe said. "Where did it go?" "Somewhere it needed to be, probably." Rose considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. Then she climbed down from the fence rail with the careful deliberateness of a child who has decided she is done with the fence rail and has other things to attend to, and walked across the yard toward Thomas and his bucket with the air of someone who has a specific plan for the immediate future. Thomas looked up at her approach and offered the bucket. Rose took it. They disappeared around the corner of the barn into whatever enterprise had just been agreed upon, and Marlowe watched them go, and Silas came through the gate and stood beside her in the garden with the morning coming fully on around them, the sun doing what it always did on clear April mornings on the plains, just filling the whole sky with itself, not asking anything, not owing anything, just going on. She picked up her trowel. He went back to the barn. This was the life. Not the story of it, not the letter and the train and the courtroom, Not the fear or the testimony or the night she went out a window with $47 and another woman's baby and the whole weight of a decision she wasn't sure she could survive making. Those things were real, and they would always be real, and she was not the kind of person who pretended otherwise. But this was also real. The trowel in her hand, and the dirt under her nails, and the sound of her children somewhere around the corner of the barn doing something inadvisable with a bucket. The smoke from her chimney, the fence that held, the garden that grew. The life she had made, out of difficult material, with imperfect hands, in a place that had not been waiting for her, and that she had made hers anyway. By showing up and doing the work, and refusing every single day to be smaller than she actually was. This was the whole of it. This was everything.